Chapter 1. Elara drove the last stretch of gravel road, the tires crunching like bones underfoot, until the house loomed into view. It was a sprawling, stoic structure of dark wood and peeling white paint, nestled amongst skeletal trees, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the wilderness. Inherited from her grandmother, it was meant to be a refuge, a quiet place to mend the ragged edges of her grief. But as she cut the engine, plunging the world into a sudden, profound silence, an unsettling stillness permeated the air, thick and heavy as the dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light. The isolation she'd craved now felt like a suffocating blanket. Inside, the air hung cool and stagnant, imbued with the faint, sweet scent of potpourri and aged paper. Shadows clung to every corner, deep and unmoving, even when the sun streamed through the grime-streaked windows. She spent the first few days simply existing, unpacking boxes listlessly, her movements muted by the house's pervasive hush. Each creak of the floorboards, each groan of the ancient plumbing, resonated with an amplified clarity that jarred her nerves. She attributed it to the quiet, to the change from the city's ceaseless hum, to her own frayed state. The first flicker was in the kitchen, a single, sharp stutter of the overhead fluorescent light just as she reached for a teacup. Her heart gave a tiny, involuntary lurch. She blinked, the light steadied, and she immediately dismissed it. Old wiring, an old house, perfectly normal. She told herself this with a conviction that felt a little too forced, even to her own ears. Later, while organizing her grandmother's cluttered study, she placed a treasured silver locket, a gift from her mother, on the edge of the mahogany desk. She turned to pull a book from a shelf, her back to the desk for mere seconds. When she turned back, the locket was gone. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. She searched frantically, her breath catching in her throat, convinced it had rolled off. After a dizzying minute, her eyes landed on it, not on the floor, nor tucked beneath a stack of papers, but sitting neatly in the center of the desk, perfectly aligned with the blotter. She stared, her mind scrambling for an explanation. Had she put it there herself? Had she been so lost in thought, so absent-minded with grief, that she'd forgotten her own actions? It was unsettling, but she forced herself to laugh, a hollow, humorless sound that died quickly in the oppressive silence. The subtle disturbances persisted, growing in frequency, if not intensity. The bathroom light would occasionally pulse, like a dying heartbeat. Keys she'd left on the entryway table would turn up on a bookshelf upstairs. Each instance, easily rationalized alone, began to weave a delicate, almost invisible thread of dread. Then came the whispers, faint, ethereal, like the rustle of dry leaves in a windless room, or the distant murmur of voices too far away to discern. She heard them most clearly at night, when the house settled into its deepest quiet. Sometimes they seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a low, indistinct hum just beneath the threshold of hearing. She would freeze, straining her ears, trying to parse meaning from the fleeting sounds, but they would always dissolve, leaving only the sound of her own accelerated pulse. "It's the house settling," she'd murmur into the darkness, her voice thin and reedy. "Old pipes, wind in the eaves." But the wind wasn't always blowing, and the pipes were often silent. She began to wonder if her solitude was warping her perception, if the quiet was amplifying the internal chaos of her grief into external manifestations. The doctor had warned her about stress, about the mind playing tricks when under duress. The house felt old, yes, but it was also beginning to feel. Aware asterisk. A pervasive chill, deeper than any draft, seemed to settle into her bones, making her shiver even when wrapped in a thick blanket. She found herself constantly turning her head, catching glimpses of nothing in her peripheral vision, feeling an invisible weight in the empty spaces around her. The fresh start she'd longed for was slowly dissolving, replaced by a creeping, insidious doubt that whispered not about the house, but about her own sanity. She was alone, in a house that refused to simply be a house, and the quiet was no longer a comfort, but a watchful, waiting presence. Chapter 2. Elara tried to impose order, a desperate ritual against the encroaching chaos. She made coffee each morning, walked through the empty rooms, planning, pretending. But her routines were a flimsy shield, each day proving more futile than the last. The subtle disturbances she'd once dismissed as an old house settling now intensified, shedding their guise of innocence. The shadows were the worst. At first they were mere tricks of the light, fleeting blurs in her peripheral vision. A curtain rippling when no window was open, a darker patch on the wall that seemed to deepen and then retract. She blamed her tired eyes, the ancient wiring, anything but what her gut insisted. Then came the undeniable. A distinct, elongated shadow detached itself from the pantry door in the kitchen, stretching across the linoleum before retracting, too fluid, too deliberate for any natural cause. She froze, a mug of half-empty coffee clattering against the counter as her hand shook. She stared, her breath catching in her throat, until her vision blurred and her mind screamed for her to look away. But the shadow was gone, leaving only the mundane reality of her sunlit kitchen and the prickling certainty that she hadn't imagined it. Objects, too, began to defy logic. A delicate, hand-painted ceramic bird, a relic from her grandmother, appeared on her pillow, though she'd last seen it on the mantelpiece downstairs. A book, one she hadn't touched in weeks, lay open to a random page in the center of the kitchen table, its spine cracked as if someone had just finished reading it. These weren't misplaced keys. These were impossible displacements, each one a tiny, unnerving violation of her personal space. She started marking items, placing small, almost invisible threads across drawers, arranging trinkets in specific patterns, only to find them disturbed, the threads broken, the patterns subtly altered. Her meticulousness was no match for whatever force played these games. Sleep became a fractured landscape of paranoia. She'd wake in the dead of night, her body rigid with an unfamiliar terror, convinced she wasn't alone. The heavy silence of the house pressed in, amplifying every creak of the old timbers, every distant murmur of the wind. She'd lie there, eyes wide open, straining to hear, to see, to find the source of the unease that vibrated through the very floorboards. Her breath hitched in her throat as she imagined forms coalescing in the darkest corners, felt unseen eyes scrutinizing her from the shadows. Her attempts to rationalize grew weaker, her internal arguments dissolving into desperate pleas. It's stress, it's grief. I'm seeing things, I'm losing my mind. The doctor's warnings echoed in her head, twisting into a cruel confirmation of her fears. Was this the breakdown she had been trying to outrun? Was the house merely a catalyst, or was it truly a participant in her unraveling? The line between her own fragile sanity and an external, malevolent force blurred into an indistinct haze. She started to speak to herself more, quiet, whispered questions into the empty rooms, as if the sound of her own voice could anchor her to reality. The pervasive chill deepened, becoming a constant companion, settling into the marrow of her bones regardless of the indoor temperature. It wasn't just a physical cold. It was an emotional one, a creeping dread that turned every empty space into a potential threat. She found herself avoiding certain rooms, hurrying through others, a sense of being perpetually watched tightening its grip around her chest. The quiet was no longer just watchful. It felt like a hungry, waiting presence, patiently observing her decline, savoring each frayed nerve ending, each whispered doubt. She was not settling into the house. The house was settling into her, piece by agonizing piece. Chapter 3. The quiet presence that had settled into the marrow of her bones began to speak. At first, it was nothing more than a faint resonance, a vibration in the air that echoed her own thoughts, a whisper of doubt, a murmur of fear, so subtle she convinced herself it was merely the frantic churn of her own mind. But then, the whispers began to differentiate themselves, growing distinct, thin as a spider silk thread, weaving through the fabric of the silence. They would catch at the edges of her hearing, forming incomplete words, sometimes sounding like a child's plaintive call, sometimes a distorted echo of her own name, stretched and warped until it felt like a curse. Elara, it would sigh from the empty hallway, alone, from the depths of her own bedroom closet. She'd snap her head around, heart hammering against her ribs, searching for a source only to find the room empty, the silence heavier than before. It was a cruel game, designed to keep her on the precipice of belief and delusion. Was she finally succumbing to the breakdown the doctors had warned her about? Was her grief manifesting as auditory hallucinations? The entity, whatever it was, seemed to feed on this uncertainty, growing bolder with each wavering moment. The physical manifestations escalated in kind. Objects weren't just misplaced, they were actively manipulated. A heavy antique clock, securely placed on the mantelpiece, would crash to the floor without warning, its shattered pieces mocking her frantic jump. Doors, latched shut, would swing open with a slow, deliberate creak, revealing only the yawning darkness of the room beyond. She'd barricade them with chairs and dressers, only to find them ajar again moments later, the furniture pushed aside as if by an unseen hand of immense strength. The air itself grew heavy, thick with a cold that seemed to suck the warmth from her very skin, an oppressive weight that pressed down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She could no longer deny the truth. There was something here, something malicious and ancient that had chosen this house to torment. But even as the certainty hardened, a counterforce of insidious self-doubt clawed at her resolve. The whispers would shift, turning accusatory, mimicking her inner anxieties. "You're imagining it, Elara. You're unraveling. They all said you would." It would be a fleeting shadow at the corner of her eye, a faint scent of decay, a sudden, sharp drop in temperature that vanished the moment she dared to acknowledge it. The entity wasn't just haunting her. It was gaslighting her, subtly eroding her grip on what was real and what was a symptom of her breaking mind. One evening, while trying to read in the living room, a book falling forgotten to the floor, a single, antique porcelain doll, a grotesque relic left by the previous owner, slid slowly from its perch on a distant shelf. It didn't fall, it moved an inch at a time until it teetered, then dropped with a sickening thud onto the plush rug. Elara stared, frozen, her breath caught in her throat. As she watched, transfixed by the doll's unmoving glass eyes, a ripple moved across its painted face, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in its expression, as if a flicker of malevolent amusement had crossed it. She wanted to scream, but the sound died in her throat, strangled by the cold grip of terror. The house had become a living prison, its walls pressing in, its unseen inhabitant a constant, insidious presence. Her attempts to anchor herself to logic were futile, each rational thought immediately contradicted by another impossible phenomenon. She found herself talking aloud more and more, not just to herself, but to the empty air, to the shadows that seemed to deepen even in broad daylight. She was trapped in a relentless cycle, belief warring with doubt, fear chasing confusion. She was no longer just experiencing a haunting. She was becoming a part of it, her mind a new plaything for the entity that watched and waited and now, finally, spoke. Chapter 4. Elara existed now on the frayed edges of reality, a skeletal figure haunted by her own reflection in the dim glass of the windows. Sleep was a forgotten luxury, replaced by a relentless cycle of dread and exhaustion, each moment a battle against the unseen forces that gnawed at her sanity. Her body ached, her head throbbed, and the world outside the house had become a distant, almost mythical concept. The whispers had stopped their gaslighting. Now they simply screamed, a discordant chorus of ancient pain and chilling glee, echoing not just in the walls but within the very chambers of her skull. She no longer spoke aloud, her voice hoarse from disuse, her thoughts fractured into 1,000 shimmering shards of fear. The house, too, had shed its subtlety. The shadows no longer merely shifted, they coalesced, deepening into opaque forms that writhed in her peripheral vision. Objects didn't just move, they flung themselves across rooms with malicious intent, shattering against walls, reminding her of the pervasive, potent rage. One particularly harrowing afternoon, a heavy, ornate mirror in the hallway detached itself from the wall and crashed to the floor, exploding into 1,000,000 sharp fragments, each reflecting a distorted, terrified image of Elara. She stood rooted, a scream trapped in her throat, watching her own unraveling multiplied infinitely. The air was thick with a palpable malevolence, a pressure that felt physical, suffocating. One night the culmination of all her terror descended. It wasn't a whisper or a shadow or a falling object. It was an unfolding nightmare, raw and visceral. She was drawn inexplicably to a small, forgotten room on the second floor, a room she'd rarely entered, now cold and stagnant. As she crossed the threshold, the air grew heavy, like wading through dense fog. The single bare bulb in the room pulsed, then died, plunging her into utter darkness. A low, keening sound began, not from the walls but from the very air around her, growing in intensity. Then a flicker. A child's room, not as it was, but as it had been. Toys lay scattered, a small wooden rocking horse stood still in the center. The wallpaper, faded floral patterns, seemed to glow with a faint, unearthly light, and there by a window, a silhouette small and still. Elara felt a wave of profound sorrow wash over her, a sorrow so deep it was not her own. The keening grew louder, tinged with a child's desperate sobs. The silhouette at the window slowly turned. It wasn't a complete form, but a shimmering outline, translucent and wavering, yet undeniably present. Its head was downcast, its small shoulders shaking. A small, delicate hand rose, pointing not at Elara, but at something unseen beyond the window. A single, heart-wrenching sob tore through the silence, followed by a whispered, fragile word, "Mama." The vision flickered, distorted, then refocused, but this time with a new, horrifying clarity. The child figure remained, but now a dark, tendril-like shadow detached itself from the walls, coiling around the child, pulling it slowly, inexorably, towards a small, intricately carved music box on a nearby dresser. The child's form struggled, ethereal screams tearing at Elara's mind, not her ears. The shadow tightened its grip, a predatory gleam radiating from its amorphous form. Elara saw a brief, fragmented image of a woman's face, contorted in grief and desperation, staring into the flickering space where the child was being consumed. Then the entire room dissolved into a maelstrom of light and shadow, the screams intensifying to an unbearable pitch. The last thing Elara saw before the darkness swallowed the vision entirely was the music box, now glowing with a faint, malevolent red light, and etched into its side, barely visible in the chaotic flicker, a name: Lydia. Elara stumbled back, gasping, hitting the opposite wall with a dull thud. Her mind reeled, trying to reconcile the horrific tableau with her crumbling reality. A child, trapped, the house, the music box, Lydia. The pieces were there, shimmering just beyond her grasp, but her terror-stricken mind was a shattered kaleidoscope, unable to assemble a coherent picture. The weight of the house, the entity's malevolent purpose, now seemed chillingly clear, not just to torment but to ensnare, to keep, to perpetuate a cycle of despair. She was not just being haunted, she was being prepared. The horror was no longer about denial, it was about a truth too monstrous to bear. Chapter 5. The name Lydia was a sliver of ice in Elara's fractured mind, a single sharp shard amidst the kaleidoscope of screams and shifting shadows. It spun, cutting through the horror of the child, the tendrils, the music box, yet it offered no solace, only a new axis for her torment. The house wasn't just old, not just haunted. It was a hungry maw, its purpose horrifyingly clear. She was not a guest, not an occupant. She was the next offering being prepared, softened, like fruit for a sinister feast. A primal scream clawed its way up her throat, but it died as a strangled gasp. Escape. The word was a desperate, flickering mantra. Her legs, heavy with fear, propelled her towards the door, her hands fumbling for the knob, a frantic scramble against the encroaching darkness. She twisted, pulled, pushed, but the wood remained inert, cold, unyielding. It wasn't locked. It was simply part of the wall. She pounded on it, her knuckles bruising against the silent resistance, a futile drumbeat against the house's impenetrable skin. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She turned, desperate, eyes darting around the room, searching for another exit, another way out. The window. She stumbled towards it, her breath ragged, hands trembling as she reached for the latch. As her fingers brushed the cold metal, the glass warped, rippling like disturbed water. The outside world, the familiar stretch of desolate trees and overcast sky, twisted into an impossible vortex of grays and blacks, drawing her gaze into its dizzying depths. She felt a sickening pull, as if the air itself was trying to suck her through the distorted pain. A chilling whisper snaked into her mind, not a sound, but a direct thought. "You are home." She recoiled, stumbling backwards, her sanity now a tattered sail in a raging storm. There was no escape. Not here, not from this. The house was a living, breathing entity, and she was trapped within its lungs. Her gaze fell upon the music box. It pulsed faintly, a soft, crimson glow emanating from its intricately carved wood, drawing her in with an undeniable, malevolent allure. Lydia. The name resonated within the box, a silent chime. Her legs moved without conscious command, carrying her towards it. Her mind screamed, raged, but her body was no longer hers. It was a puppet, a vehicle drawn by an invisible string. As she approached, the lid of the music box slowly, deliberately creaked open. A soft, tinkling melody, impossibly clear and sweet, drifted into the silence, yet it was laced with a profound, aching sorrow. It was the sound of a child's lullaby, twisted, broken, filled with the echoes of a distant, unimaginable grief. The music was a key, unlocking something deep within the house within her. Images flashed before her eyes, not visions but memories that weren't her own, yet felt horribly familiar. A young girl, fair-haired and laughing, spinning in the sunlight, the same melody playing from the very box now before her. Then shadows, always the shadows. A woman, her face contorted in a silent scream, pressing her ear to the music box, desperately trying to hear a sound that was no longer there. Her face blurred, shifting, her features twisting into Elara's own, then back again. Lydia, it was her, and Elara, they were the same. The music swelled, becoming a cacophony of lost innocence and eternal despair. The walls around her began to throb, a deep, resonant pulse that matched the frantic beat of her own dying heart. Tendrils of shadow, like those that had consumed the child, began to writhe from the floorboards, from the seams in the wallpaper, coiling around her ankles, her wrists gently, inexorably pulling her closer to the open music box. Her breath hitched, a silent sob tearing through her. She tried to fight, to scream, but her limbs were heavy, her voice locked away. She peered into the open box. It wasn't empty. It held a swirling vortex of darkness, imbued with that same faint, malevolent red light. As the shadows tightened their grip, pulling her forward, her reflection appeared in the depths of the box, distorted, wavering, fading. Her form became translucent, shimmering at the edges, her eyes wide with a terror that was no longer her own, but the cumulative fear of every lost soul captured within these walls. The music reached a crescendo, then snapped, cutting off abruptly. Elara's vision blurred. Her body dissolved, not into nothingness, but into the shimmering air, a flicker. She was a ghost in her own skin, a translucent echo of herself. The final fragment of her sanity shattered, scattering like dust motes in the spectral light. She was no longer Elara, not entirely. She was the flicker, the shadow in the corner of an unsuspecting eye, the whisper that wasn't quite a sound. She was part of the house now, another lost soul tethered to its insidious melody, eternally watching, eternally waiting, forever part of the haunting she had failed to comprehend, forever subject to the despair she could not overcome. The house settled around her, a slow, contented sigh. The music box closed with a soft click.